welcome back to RPMbassy. So today's the 4th of July and I thought, what can I review that kind of encompasses America and all that they're about. And first of all, I realised I don't have that many American albums. And second of all, I didn't really know what direction to pull it. Do we go for something that's patriotic, or do we go for something that has the all guns firing, blazing kind of fashion that America sort of is always perceived as having? And then I kind of thought, you know what, I'm just going to pick a fun American album. And the one I've picked is Enema of the State by Blink-182. So a lot of people at the very least know the cover of this if you don't know what the album is, but it was a big album for the band. 1st of June 1999 this released. This essentially is, in my eyes, not only is like a turning point for them, but is a turning point for kind of pop punk, skate punk, whatever the hell you want to call it as a genre. It kind of almost like not only ushers in a new millennium in terms of the time it releases, but it ushers in this like entirely new approach to punk and pop punk and sort of the, like radio friendly approach to that kind of sound. So, you know, prior to this, you had, you know, big stuff like Green Day's Dookie and things like that. Punk in Drublic by NoFX, which you can quite clearly hear like the influence of that album, especially on here. But this, in terms of the sound, is very, very clean and polished, despite kind of having, you know, the punk aesthetic and the punk sound, or the pop punk sound, I should say. But it's very clean and it is very commercial in its way, which isn't a downside, in my opinion. And, you know, regardless of what you think about a band taking that approach, it clearly worked, because this kind of set, in many ways, set the sort of benchmark for a lot of albums and a lot of bands that came after. So this is their shortest album, and it's their first album with Travis Barker, who nowadays we kind of think of as being like, you know, he is part of the core lineup, but he wasn't a founding member. Scott Rayner was the drummer for the two releases previous to this, but in some ways this kind of does almost feel like kind of like the real debut. Obviously you've got Dude Ranch, which came just before this, and Cheshire, which came before that, but this at least to me, when I think of Blink-182, I think of this sound and everything that came after, not what came prior to it. You know, Damn It is a great song, but when you compare the drum sounds and the drum style, they're both pop punk drummers, they're both punk drummers, but when you listen to Dude Ranch, it is quite samey all the way through. And it's not to say that Scott Rayner wasn't a good drummer. He was very, very good at what he did. But there was, it felt, despite it being an aggressive style, felt very safe in terms of sort of how someone would express themselves on drums. Whereas with this, you get kind of an interesting look at something other than just like double time. And I quite appreciate that, despite the fact that this is, you know, making that pop punk sound more commercial. It's actually broadening it as well at the same time. And there's a very good video on YouTube by a drummer called Harry Myrie, who I highly, highly recommend having a look at. It's all about Travis Barker and his drum style and the way he does fills and the way he approaches the drums. And I think when you look at that and then you look at the way that he's kind of, you know, expanded out into tons and tons of different bands and features and things over the years, you can kind of see why Travis Barker is as big of a name as he is, which is not to take away from Mark Hoppus or Tom DeLonge, but I think Travis Barker is kind of the star of the show on this. And the ironic thing is he wasn't actually like properly credited as a composer on the album, despite the fact that he obviously wrote like the vast majority, if not all, of the drum parts. He wasn't actually an official member by the time that this album came out, so he wasn't really credited for his work on it. It's pretty much just credited like Tom DeLonge and Mark Hoppus, and that's it. But really, you can kind of see, listening to this, you can kind of tell that this is like the correct three-piece. And I think as well, if you look at interviews from the time, you can read bits and pieces that both Mark and Tom have said about how Travis's playing kind of forced them to get better and to really up their game, which is, it's nice to see that sort of like camaraderie. And I guess as well, it's probably was quite a relief coming from the sort of the drama that they had with Scott Rayner in the sort of years leading up to it. Essentially, he'd been kind of like in and out of the band and had to leave, had to come back, and it's all to do with like drugs and drink and that sort of thing. And eventually, they sort of, it's hard to tell what exactly is the truth. Some people say he quit, some people say he was kicked out, other people say he was offered to go to rehab to stay in the band and he agreed, but then was still kicked out anyway. Bit of a messy thing, and it still, from what I can tell, still seems to be a sore subject within that sort of group of people anyway. But as I say, when you listen to this, you listen to the previous work, I think without taking anything away from what Scott Rayner did and how he plays music, Travis Barker is a more ideal fit for the sound that they clearly wanted to pursue in the end. And the story of him joining the band is actually quite interesting. So there was a period of time while on tour that Scott Rayner wasn't able to perform or had left the tour halfway through. And Travis Barker, who at that point was in the ska band The Aquabats, which is a band that I'd like forgotten even existed until I was researching this again, he essentially stepped in and like learned, like I think it's a 20-song set in about 2 hours and pretty much played it start to finish perfectly. And there's a snippet of an interview from one of the members of the Aquabats who said, watching them play that set live, he knew immediately that was the three-piece and that was where they should be. And he said like he wished that they had started looking for a new drummer straight away, because he already knew that Travis wasn't long to stay in Aquabats because of how good he was in Blink. So outside of Travis Barker and me shilling him, obviously the album itself, as I said, huge success. It's a really polished, really clean sound for something that, in terms of sound of a genre, is traditionally quite a grimy DIY sound. This is very polished, very pristine sounding, but it still has that energy. It's a really nice balance. It's quite heavy in a way, and I think Tom DeLonge, it always seems like he's kind of erred on the side of having like a heavier, slightly more metal guitar tone. He's always preferred like Mesa Boogie rectifier amplifiers and stuff like that, which, when I think of a Mesa Boogie, like a dual rectifier, I immediately think metal. I don't think pop punk. And so I think things like that, they kind of all merge together to make it a heavier sounding album while still being, incredibly accessible. So I mentioned Green Day's Dookie a minute ago. Jerry Finn, the producer of that album, stepped on board for recording this, and again, from like stories that you read about the studio process, it seems like it was quite fun, and there was like a level of camaraderie. Like, again, stories of like Travis Barker and how he would like interact with Finn were very. There seemed like there was a lot of banter going on, which I think is kind of a good environment for an album to be recorded in. It feels like there's like a level of relaxation where people aren't necessarily always like stressed out. They're not trying too hard, and so I think in some ways that kind of comes over in the performances. The one sort of aspect of that which doesn't ring true is the vocals. Tom DeLonge in later interviews has said that he wishes he hadn't tried as hard on the vocals because he feels like they felt overly processed. For me, I think, again, like as with everything, it's very, very clear, very crisp, very easy to listen to, and it feels polished. So I don't think it's a downside, but perhaps he would have preferred a bit more of a less perfect take on some of the vocals, perhaps. But again, talking about Travis Barker, the drum takes allegedly were all played live without clicks, without headphones, which is remarkable if that is true. To be able to essentially stay on time so perfectly. I mean, at that point, he is basically a human metronome. So, yeah, like, hats off to him for that. The album artwork is very iconic. We all kind of know this cover. And I remember even before I like knew who Blink-182 were, I remember seeing this cover around, and it's sort of kind of attracting that level of like slight controversy because it's a little bit sexy and it's a little bit kinky and stuff like that. So the person on the cover is an adult actress, Janine Lindemulder, I believe is her name. Allegedly, the band didn't actually know that she was an adult actress. They sort of just picked someone from a list of available models, and it just so happened that they picked her, which is quite funny that they sort of ended up with an actual porn star. This cover has had a couple of iterations over the years. The main changes being that at times she's had a t-shirt on rather than just having the sort of bra under the white coat, and some of the early versions did have a red cross on the hat, which of course is in violation of the Geneva Conventions. If you're aware of that, you're not allowed to use it for like marketing purposes or for like media and things like that. You can't use a red cross because it's considered like an actual, like, you know, it's an official medical thing, blah 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 blah, and it's an official organisation. So yeah, we've kind of got like the middle ground one on this copy, where there's no t-shirt covering the bottom half, but there is also no red cross. And then the back cover is a bit of a weird one. You've got all the boys with basically nothing on. So yeah, fun one there. What's interesting especially is the orientation. So you've got the front cover there, but when you turn it around, you then have to do that to see the track listing. Bit of an odd one. I don't know if that's intentional. Presumably it is. You'd spend more than 5 minutes putting together an album cover. And then the middle, I probably won't show you that, to be honest. It's probably all right, but we won't risk it. As for the actual inserts themselves, you've got a sort of nice paper fold out with all the sort of lyrics and the thank yous and that sort of standard stuff. And then something that I had not been aware of until I got this album a fair while ago now is all of this sort of like graphic designy stuff, which I really, really love. These are bits and pieces that I hadn't seen for a long time. And yeah, I personally kind of like this aesthetic, the sort of the blue, the green, or the blue, the white and the red. Yeah, really, really nice. And then inside the album with sort of like pill logos for the Blink-182 logo and the sides of the album. Yeah, just like a nice kind of bit of a dichotomy between that kind of graphic design kind of approach and then that at the same time. But yeah, it works. In terms of the songs on here, you've got Watch My Age Again, Adam's Song, and All the Small Things. Those are the really big ones that everybody knows, All the Small Things especially. And, you know, they are what they are. They're very commercial, accessible pop punk hits. For me, I would say my personal preferences on here are Dumpweed, the opening track. I think the drumming on that especially is fantastic, but it's a really great way to kind of just get straight into an album, like kind of hits you off over the head really, really quickly and just brings the energy up like immediately. So I love that. And then Going Away to College is my other favourite on the album. There's a section towards the end, sort of like in the bridge, which is kind of is a good example of what I said about Travis Barker's choice to not just play like double time or punk time drums. And it's a really nice kind of snare march kind of sound, which, you know, it's just a nice bit of variety. It kind of brings the tempo down, and there are bits and pieces throughout the album with that. And I think that is, for me, one of the reasons why it's lasted so well, is that it's not just full-on pop punk or punk drumming all the way through. There is something to kind of keep you interested. Not that you need it really. It's like 35 minutes long. It's like basically what, like 2 songs on here go over 3 minutes, and one of them is Adam's song, which is like 5 minutes. But everything else is like 2 minutes 30. Like it is short and to the point a lot of the time, and so it's hard for it to overstay its welcome, really. So in terms of the reception when the album came out, it was very, very positive from a lot of people, but also heavily, heavily panned by a select few. A good example is John Lydon, Johnny Rotten, from the Sex Pistols. He slated them. He called them like silly boys and said it was like watching a comedy act or something. Which, like, I mean, fair enough, but at the end of the day, like, people loved this stuff, and I think a lot of people. For me, there are some musicians who take themselves a bit too seriously. You know, I've always looked at music as being like first and foremost being fun, and if you can't enjoy yourself, or you can't appreciate when others are enjoying themselves, regardless of whether or not they are trying to make money with it or not, like, it's just kind of like get over yourself a bit, you know. But you know, he's entirely entitled to his opinion, but the sort of the certifications don't lie. This hit like top 10 in like Australia, Canada, America. I think it was like number 15 in the UK. Like, it did well in a lot of territories, and as I said earlier, like, this kind of like shot them to the moon in terms of stardom, and certainly within kind of like the rock and pop punk scene of that era. Like, this kind of made them royalty and really kind of influenced a lot of stuff that came after. As far as like other critiques that came, a lot of it was from like quote unquote true punk people, like labels and stuff that really focused on like hardcore punk and things like that. They weren't happy with it. A lot of emo acts were upset with it. But again, like, when you look at what came after and the way that even like the genre of emo and screamo and post-hardcore and all of that kind of like sort of broader adjacent music sort of that came out afterwards, like, the influences are quite undeniable in my opinion. And you know, then you had Take Off Your Pants and Jacket and the self-titled album that came out in the sort of the 4 or 5 years afterwards, and you know, that kind of like really solidified them as like, oh, they are here to stay. They're an act that aren't really, you know, they're not a one and done. They're just going to keep releasing heavy hitters. For me, I think that the self-titled is the best album they did. I think that kind of lean towards the sort of emo sound for me was preferential. But this is still a very, very good album. I think it sounds great, as I said, like the cleanliness and that pristine kind of sound for something that is otherwise a very punky, very kind of aggressive album. For me, it works really, really well. And because the songs are so short, I can kind of go back and listen to them, kind of drop in and out whenever I want. And, you know, I think it still works great. If you don't like it, fair enough. I know a lot of purists aren't going to enjoy it, but I think it's a fun album and it's entertaining, it's enjoyable to listen to, it's catchy. I got no problems with it personally. If you really can't stand them and you don't want to give the whole album a listen, at the very least I would say give Going Away to College a try. For me, it's not as kind of commercial sounding. There's a little bit more of that kind of songwriting thought put into it. So I think if you're gonna give any song a try, give that one a shot. And obviously Adam's song entirely different from the rest of the album. So if you're looking for something a little bit more thoughtful and introspective, there's that as well. So yeah, at the very least, give those a shot. And if you somehow haven't heard the rest of the album anyway, I mean, I recommend it. It's good fun. That's it.